Hello and welcome everybody. In the next session, we want to take a closer look at sustainable urban mobility. What is it all about? What are the key challenges and instruments? And what are some lessons learned and good examples? My name is Nikolai Dörr. I'm a senior consultant at Civity Mangement Consultants, and I'm very happy to be here with you today and share some of our experience from projects we do with public transport companies, cities, regulators, and mobility providers. If you don't know Civity, Civity is a management consultancy firm based in Hamburg and Berlin with a special focus on public transport, rail, and mobility. So what are we going to talk about today? First of all, we want to give you some introduction about how the sustainable city and urban mobility are connected, what are common goals, and what are key challenges. Then we will talk about two basic frameworks, how you can tackle those challenges and how you can structure your instruments, before we get a little bit more into detail into different modes of transportation and different instruments. Why do we need to talk about mobility when we talk about a sustainable city? One reason is that mobility systems are an integral part of every city and everyday life in cities. Therefore, we cannot achieve the sustainable city without making sure that our mobility system is up for the challenge. As you can see here, there are a lot of mutual goals, of which we put a few on the slide here. Many of them are directly linked to mobility. For example, creating an affordable and accessible mobility system, making sure the system is energy efficient, or reduce greenhouse gas emissions overall. But it is really more than just common goals between mobility and the sustainable city. As we will see later, the structure of the city itself plays a crucial role in shaping the demand for mobility and the structure of mobility. And resulting mobility behaviors, in turn, will influence the city's future development, its livability and sustainability. So if we want to get closer to the goal of a sustainable city in terms of environmental protections, in terms of safety, it is mandatory that we take our mobility system into consideration. Having said this, let's take a look at some numbers and figures that illustrate how interconnected the two of them really are. So as we see here, the transport sector is an essential lever to address environmental, social, and economic challenges on a global scale. On the left-hand side, we see the global greenhouse gas emissions in 2016, broken down into different sectors. And we can see that transportation is accountable for nearly 16% of all global emissions. If you would break down those 16% further, you would see that road transport accounts for 12%, aviation for around 2%, and shipping for 1.5%. But it's not just the environment. Also, it has a social dimension, as we see in the middle part here, talking about global road fatalities. Those are numbers from the WHO saying that in 2018, 1.35 million people died from road crashes. And this is not accounting for people who get hurt in traffic accident or get disabled in traffic accident, nor does it account for people who suffer from noise pollution or bad air quality. So overall, road fatalities are the 8th leading cause of death for people all ages, and the number 1 cause of death for young people, aged between 5 and 29 years old. In addition, there's a disparity between high-income countries and low-income countries. We can see that the death rate in low-income countries is 3 times higher than in high-income countries. So that's another important thing we need to tackle in terms of health and in terms of safety. The third part I'd like to talk about at this point is the land use. As you all know, the urban space we have, the land we have in cities is limited, and there's competition for it. Do we use it for housing? Do we use it to build streets or maybe parks or whatever? And this competition is increasing due to a number of developments. First of all, more and more people are moving into the city, and the overall population is growing. And more and more people are buying cars and having a car at home. So this is also increasing the pressure on this competition. This is especially important because there we need a method to balance those needs. And in many cities, we see that there's a growing disparity of how those land usage is priced. For example, if you live in Hamburg like I do and you want to buy a residential parking permit, you have to pay like 25 to 30 euros a year. That gives you access to around 15, 16 square meters of public space to park your car. If you want to rent a flat and add an additional room of 15 square meters, you probably pay something like 150 euros each month. So overall, just from this very small comparison, you can see that renting space in a city is 60 to 70 times more expensive than renting space in a city to park your car there. So we need to find a mechanism to make sure that the limited space we have, that it's more and more competed for, that we have a good method to balance those needs for urban space. And it's not just about rents and parking fees, but also about the different modes of transportation. This is a very famous picture illustrating the space required to fit 72 people into cars, on bikes, or in a bus. And even though this picture was taken nearly 30 years ago, it is still up to date. Its message is still important because in terms of space requirement, it is really not so much important whether those vehicles on the left-hand side, if they are electric, if they use a fuel cell, or if they can drive on their own. To be fair, in this picture, it is assumed that on average 1.2 people traveling in the same car. But the overall relation we see here between the different modes of transportation in terms of how much space they require. This really doesn't reverse or change if we assume a lower occupation rate for buses or a higher occupation rate for vehicles. As a last slide on the challenges, I'd like to break down the numbers a little bit more into different countries before we take a look at instrument that we can use. Of course, it's important to keep in mind the difference between each country and each city, because there is no one-size-fits-it-all solution, and the answer to the question of how we can make our mobility system more sustainable, of course, is different depending on what your framework conditions are and what are your priorities in terms of where you want to go. And without going too much into detail, we can see here, of course, that there are structural differences between different countries. For example, in terms of the road fatalities or CO2 emissions per capita. And of course, we need to take those preconditions into consideration. For example, in Germany, you see that we have a very high motorization rate with more than 500 cars per 1,000 inhabitants and a comparably high rate of urbanization. So as a consequence, of course, for us, it's important to reduce this dependency on private cars and motorized individual travel. So this might be different in other cities where maybe people are not using the car so much. But what I'd like to point out here is that, of course, there are structural differences and we need to take them into account. But basically, the problem is they all share the same structure. We're always talking about safety. We're always talking about shifting mobility patterns to more sustainable modes of transportation and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So far, we talked about the connection between mobility and a sustainable city and the key challenges. So now let's get into what can we do about it. And before we get into the details, I'd like to point out two frameworks you can use. First, the ASI framework, which was co-developed by the GIZ, and one really key learning that need to be taken into consideration. That is the combination of push and pull instruments I'd like to talk about. So before we talk about specific instruments, of course, there are 1,000 things you can do. So we think you need a framework. It's very helpful to have a framework to structure what you're doing and why you're doing it. What are your goals of the different instruments? Might be planning or might be regulatory instruments or economic instruments. So that's why we shortly give you an introduction into this ASI framework. And since you're working with the GIZ, you probably already know this. As I said, it was co-developed by the GIZ, and it's a demand-focused approach that takes the perspective of the user, which makes it, at least to me, very intuitive and very easy to communicate. Again, I'm not going into too much detail, but as I said, in our experience, it's very helpful to have such a framework. And so basically, there are three main categories of instruments, or three main ways we can go. First of all, we can try to avoid motorized travel wherever possible. That means we can replace physical mobility with digital mobility if it's possible. For example, by having a conference like this online instead of all of us traveling to Berlin or some other place. But we can also try to reduce the need for motorized travel if we shorten the trip distance, for example, to a more compact city development, so that walking and cycling become an alternative for specific trips we take. And next, we can try to shift traffic from less sustainable or less efficient modes of transportation to more efficient modes of transportation in terms of energy and space consumption. And usually this is the part where we try to shift traffic from private cars, from private passenger vehicles, to public transport or to active forms of mobility. But of course, and this is the third pillar, there will always be some motorized cars or buses or whatever we will see in the future traveling on our streets, and for them we need to make sure that they run as efficiently as possible in terms of what kind of energy sources do they use, what is the business model behind, and how energy and space efficient are those modes of transportation. So today we will talk mainly about how to shift traffic and how to avoid motorized traffic in the first place. And the second concept, the second framework I'd like to talk about before we go into details is the combination of push and pull instruments. And this is one key learning, one overall learning from nearly all of the projects we did that I'd like to point out here. That we've seen that if you want to change the mobility behavior and realize a substantial modal shift, you need to work on this from both sides, through pull measures and through push measures. On the one hand, you need to improve the means of transportation that you want to promote. You need to create an incentive to use it. But on the other hand, you always you have to induce change by implementing push measures that decrease the incentive for the mobility behavior you want to get rid of, or that give us a little push to reevaluate our mobility choices. So for example, if you want to promote the use of public transport, this will be the most effective if you make sure that you have a high quality public transport system, of course, on the one hand, but also have some push measures like parking management on the other hand, that gives people this little extra push. So we wrote down here some possible push and pull instruments, but the key learning is that it's really the combination of both what makes each instrument effective. And down below, we added some cities that you can take a look at. First of all, Vienna. We decided to go with this city because we have some experience with the public transport provider. And also we conducted a study covering the whole subject. So if you're interested in more details, I will show you the link to the study later. So enough introduction, let's get into the different instruments and the different modes of transportation. And we will start with walking and cycling as the probably most sustainable parts of mobility. And then we talk about public transport and shared mobility. And of course, we also talk a little bit about the reallocation of space. Walking and cycling are the most sustainable modes of transportation, and we need to make sure that we can make use of their potential as far as possible, because especially in urban areas, they can account for a substantial share of mobility, and we need to make sure that we have the right instruments into place and that we have them integrated in transportation planning and urban planning on an equal level to public transport and to cars. So Of course, we need to have the right infrastructure and that it's safe to use, that it's accessible for everyone, even if you're, for example, on a cargo bike or if you have a stroller. And we need a comprehensive network. It's not just single roads starting and ending out of nowhere, but really a comprehensive network for cycling and walking. Of course, there's also, again, we can benefit from the city development that focus on compactness and mixed usage in a way that we try to realize a 50-minute city where every important or most of the important areas can be reached with active forms of mobility. And it's really not just, that's why I put the two of them together, it's really not just getting from A to B, but also about how livable a city is. And that's the connection between active forms and mobility and a livable city that, as you can see here on this picture, usually we consider cities where people are walking, where they take a break and sit down, where they go to restaurants and so on. Also, those are important elements of a livable city, and we need to think the two of them together instead of just trying to get people quickly from A to B on their feet or by cycling. And there's a really interesting book that I can recommend on this, written by the Danish architect Jan Gehl, called "The City for People," Cities for People, and he really points out the different needs of people who walk, of people who are cycling, and gives you a good idea what is important in terms of how the infrastructure needs to be and what are good examples. For sure, there are always some more things you can do to promote walking and cycling in your city that depend on your local strategy and your local preconditions. For example, it might be useful to promote charging infrastructure if you want to encourage the use of pedelecs or e-cargo bikes in a more challenging topography. And of course, Copenhagen is well known as a good practice for cycling infrastructure, as they have decades of investing in infrastructure and have dedicated bike highways or even bike bridges. So there are a lot of things you can learn from the way it is done in Copenhagen. And they also coined this phrase to Copenhagenize, means to create a city that is bike friendly. But what is important to keep in mind is that cycling is really not limited to flat cities where it's always warm and never rainy. But we see that also there are cities who manage to become a very bike capital, so to say, that are in more northern countries like Oslo or Helsinki, or even in South America, in Bogota, for example. And also cycling can be an important part in smaller cities like we see in Münster in Germany or in Utrecht in the Netherlands. And one of the key challenges in promoting active forms of mobility is the limited urban space. As I said before, the space is limited and there's competition for it. And as walking and cycling usually weren't a top priority in transportation and urban planning, their share of infrastructure or their share of public spaces in many cases is really the bare minimum. So if we want to put in a new bike lane, or if we want to widen pedestrian ways, we need to make sure that we get the space from different modes of transportation. And what we can do is, for example, we redesign streets and public spaces by closing them for motorized travel. We can reduce the number of on-street parking opportunities or parking places in the first place. And this will give us some room, some new space we can use and dedicate for walking and cycling. But in all of the projects, we always see that there is a very strong resistance by people who maybe have shops or stores in the streets, and they are afraid that there will be less customers or people living in the streets and don't know where they shall park their car in the future. So this is really a key challenge. How can we get this done right? And of course, it's not just that we have this challenge of resistance, or that we need to have the right participation and communication concepts in place. But also sometimes the legislation for land use or for parking management is difficult. For example, if we want to raise the prices of parking, that's not always just possible in any way we want to do it, but we have to take the local legislation into consideration. So one best practice or interesting practice for redesigning public spaces I'd like to share with you at this point is the redesign and reorganization of the Maria Hilfer Street in Vienna. Here you can see some pictures before and after the redesign. This project really was highly controversial at the beginning because it was a former car street and it should be transformed into a pedestrian way, into shared spaces in which, for example, buses could drive. So we would have a shared space of buses and pedestrian and cyclists and so on. And there really was a strong resistance from political parties, from local shop owners, and from local people living there to some parts. So what they did in Vienna, they really developed a comprehensive communication and participation program with multiple surveys, with different formats of participation, like creative workshops or dialogue forums or a website, a newsletter, and so on. And what was very important, there was a trial period where only part of the street was changed, and people could experience this. And after the trial period, there was the final decision. 50,000 people were asked to vote if the street should be redesigned or not. And at the time being, it really was a close call because only 53% of the people said, yes, let's redesign it. But after it was done, a couple of months later, they had another survey. And in this survey, the support for this measure already increased to 71%, saying, if I would be to vote again, I would vote, yes, let's do it. So this is really an interesting example if you want to get more into the details and get more of the idea how such a communication concept can look like and what can be done to make sure that the people are part of this process and can put in their ideas. So there will be a way to address those resistances and make the whole project successful. So this is another example I'd like to share, and that's the restoration of the River Sieg in Germany. As I said before, walking and cycling usually weren't that high of a priority in urban planning in Germany. So as a consequence, this area was used as a parking lot for many decades. And only a couple of years ago, it was redesigned and reorganized to serve as an urban green space that can now be used for walking and cycling and leisure activities. And of course, if you compare those pictures, I think it's really easy to answer the question where the quality of living is higher. And I think it's really important to have such pictures and to show the vision and to show people why it is important to reallocate space and why it might be useful to get rid of some parking spaces or find another way where the cars can be parked. So this is real quick as a second example of reallocating public space. So after we talked about walking, cycling, and reallocation, we will take a look at public transport and shared mobility offers. Most of the projects that we do are within public transport companies. And if you know a little bit about public transport companies, you will know that they are usually very complex, that they have a very challenging legal and financial framework to operate in, and they have been growing for a large number of years. So we have some organizational things we need to address. And what we do really get into the different areas that you can see here, talking about the service network, talking about infrastructure management, communication, fares and sale, also organizational structures, and so on. But again, at this point, I'd like to take the perspective of the ASI framework and the customer and see what's important to him in terms of what are his interfaces to a public transport service operator. And of course, first of all, it's the service network. Then we have to talk about fares and sales. and of course also communication and operations are part. So I do not want to talk too much about, let's say, the legal and financial framework, and it's not so important from a customer point of view. What is important to the customer, of course, is in terms of the service network, the accessibility of a service. Can public transport users reach the stops and enter the vehicles on their own? How good is the accessibility? How frequent is the service? Is the volume of service offered adequate? Is the frequency so that it's easy to understand? Let's say every 15, every 20 minutes. If you're in an urban area, if you go to the suburban areas or rural areas, it's probably less. So this is about having a high frequency, but also having the right frequency that's easy to remember and that's connected to other services. So if you have to change, that is made sure that you will get your next bus. And besides accessibility and frequency, of course, also it's about the suitability of the service. Are the relevant routes served, and is the number of changes acceptable? So if I want to get from A to B, is there a direct connection I can take, or do I have to change, and is made sure that I will get my connection if I change at a certain stop? So that's about service network. We will talk a little bit about how we can improve this using new methods of data and data analytics in just a few moments. And the second topic I'd like to talk about a little bit more is the fares and sale part, because I read it all. Also, some of you are thinking about some e-ticketing, so we'll give you a short overview about what can be done there. First of all, to e-ticketing systems. We saw that some of you are thinking about this in their project descriptions, so we want to give you a short overview about different systems that are currently in place, how they differentiate their business model, and if they use this e-ticketing system to put some fare innovation into place. And as we can see here, there are various business models. Some use it only as a different method of payment for the users of their public transport system. Some use it to integrate more services like municipality bike sharing or the access to libraries. So that's the first question. And what's, in terms of a public transport perspective, even more interesting is the question, do we use the system to change our fare system or to put into place new innovative fares that can be used with this new e-ticketing system? For example, in London, we see that the Oyster card provides the opportunity to differentiate the ticket and the price depending on the time of the day. It's cheaper if you travel off-peak times, and if you travel at peak times, the ticket will be more expensive if you use the Oyster card. If you pay cash, the ticket is always the same price. It's always a price that's higher than the peak price of the Oyster card. So that's the way you can use those e-ticketing system to make sure that demand is spread a little bit more over the day, and try to steer the mobility demand in this way. In general, when it comes to fare systems, we need to take into account that there are some trade-offs that we need to address. First of all, we want to have a just fare system in a way that if you travel a short distance, it should be less expensive than if you're traveling a long system. So we would need a lot of different prices for more or less the same service. On the other hand, we want to make sure that the customer is able to understand the fare system very easily and it doesn't take him 10 minutes to understand what is the right ticket for him. So we need to find a balance here. Another trade-off is the question between how expensive should a ticket be. And of course, in setting an incentive to use public transport and of public transport being accessible for every income groups, the price should be low. But if we think about the operational side of the company, we need to make sure that there is some income generated by running the service. So therefore, a higher price would be, of course, more suitable. And between all those different goals that we have when it comes to fare systems, we need to find a good balance to make sure that our public transport system is up for the challenge. So the second dimension I'd like to talk about in terms of public transport is the suitability of the service. How can we make sure that there's a service that satisfies the mobility needs within a city? And how can we identify those needs in the first place? Of course, traditionally there have been many methods to plan public transport systems, but due to the digitalization, there are some new sources of data and some new tools to summarize, to collect, and to analyze data. And we want to give you a short insight into how this might be useful to enhance your planning for public transport services, or maybe for different mobility services as well, and how you can make your planning more demand-based. As you can see here, we plotted the data we collected from two different sources. The first is the phone data, so your mobile phone can be tracked within the city to give us this origin-destination matrix that you see here on the right-hand side. In blue, those lines indicate where people were moving within the cities and at which time. That's one source to analyze mobility patterns, and another possibility is to take a look at timetable information systems, where people put in their trip request and try to find out what is the best connection. And as they put in, again, the origin and destination, you can summarize this data and put it on a map to find out where are the important relations between the city and the suburbs, for example, and see if there's a proper public transport service offered at this route. And if not, maybe that's a potential to put in a new bus line or to change the direction of the bus line. Last but not least, we want to take a look at shared mobility solutions. What is their potential, how are they used at the moment, and what is maybe the way forward? And first of all, when it comes to new technologies being introduced, maybe in transportation or in different sectors, we need to make sure that there's expectation management of what they can do and what they are capable of. And with the new innovations like the digitalization or mobile data and mobile payment, we saw a lot of new flexible mobility solutions like bike sharing, free-floating bike sharing, car sharing, the e-scooters at the moment, probably self-driving cars somewhat in the future. And what can happen is that usually at the beginning only a few people know about this, and this is called the hype cycle, that the more this gets into the public awareness, there's a peak of inflated expectations. So those mobility solutions, they are advertised and claim to have the potential to disrupt urban mobility and be a solution to make it more sustainable and more just and equal, so to say. And I think we saw this with quite a few new mobility services, may it be the free-floating car sharing or the e-scooters at the moment, that we really have high expectations when they roll out or before they roll out. But then we need to find out and realize that urban transportation is really a complex system, and those new mobility solutions need time to fit in. We need to make experience how they are used, if they are suitable to help us or not, and also the operators need to get this learning curve to better understand how they can run their service without making a loss. So usually then we have this sort of this illusion where the expectation and the public interest in the service decreases before we have an adaptation to the conditions at hand and can have those services integrated in a productive way, so they are actually supporting our mission of sustainable urban mobility. So having said this, we want to take a closer look of how those services, especially free-flowing car sharing and e-scooters, are used, and then we can see if they can keep up with the promise to disrupt urban mobility. And of course, I don't want this to be too negative. I think shared mobility is a great innovation and can be very useful and helpful. But as we see in a moment, there they are just operating in niches at the moment. So we have to make sure what our priority is in this respect. So I think they really can change things also in a disruptive way, but that's not on the scale of mobility, but maybe on special markets like the cab market, or if we have different business models that can be disrupted by the innovations. What we did a couple of years ago, we wanted to test whether free-floating car sharing will disrupt our mobility system, and therefore we collected the data of free-floating rentals in 2013 and 2014. We collected around 18 million rentals, and based on this, we came up with some analysis. On the first glance, you can see that the share of car sharing trips compared to overall traffic in Berlin is very low. It's less than 1%. It's 0.1%. So in terms of how influential is it compared to the overall traffic, it's really just a niche, or at least was a niche when we collected this data. And in terms of location, you can see here on this map on the right-hand side that most of the trips are done within the city center, within the railway ring in Berlin here. And our analysis showed that 50% of the trips are shorter than 5 kilometers. So usually that would be trips that we consider to be taken by active forms of mobility or public transport. And if we take a look at the distribution time-wise, we would see that the peak of the rentals is in the after-work hours or in weekends. So we assume that those services are usually used for convenient reasons, and their overall relevance for mobility is limited to a very small part. Another recent innovation in urban mobility are e-scooters. And to get a better understanding of how and when they are used, we collected the movement data for some European cities in 2019, as you can see here. On the left-hand side, you can see the number of e-scooters in each city. We can see that they range from a couple of hundred e-scooters in smaller cities to a couple of thousand scooters in bigger cities. And on average, a scooter was moved between 3 and 5 times a day, which gives us an indication of their relevance for urban mobility. For example, if we take a look at Gothenburg, we have around 6,000 scooters that were moved 3 times a day. So as a result, we get 18,000 trips. And if we compare this to the overall traffic volume in a city, we find that scooters only play a marginal role for the overall traffic. On average, scooters are used for distances up to 2 kilometers, indicating that those trips are comparable to distances that are usually done by walking or cycling. And time-wise, we found that the usage of e-scooters peaks in the after-work hours and on weekends. So if we put all of this together, what we can see in the data, we therefore assume that e-scooters are currently mostly used for recreational and tourist usage, and less used for first mile, last mile solutions, for example, to the public transport system. But this is a very early analysis, and we have to keep track of how e-scooters are used, how they are managed in cities, to get a better understanding of this in the future. So shared mobility was the last point of our agenda for today, or nearly the last point. We talked about the challenge of sustainable urban mobility and how it is connected to the sustainable city. We talked about frameworks and different modes of transportation. So now our time is nearly up. I'd like to give you some further information if you'd like to know more about some topics we talked about earlier. If you want to know more and read more about the things I just talked about, please feel free to visit our homepage. From time to time, we publish our own studies there that can be found for free. For example, there's one study concerning the free-floating car sharing data I talked about, and one study about the public transport system in Vienna. Concerning the e-scooters, there's a dedicated webpage, also available in English, you can take a look at. And of course, be aware that the ASI framework that I talked about earlier is available in 35 languages online and gives you a really comprehensive and good overview about different instruments. Also, if you want to know more about cycling and walking, I recommend taking a look at the Copenhagen Ice Index that can also be found online. Having said this, we reached the end of this presentation, and I'd like to say thank you very much for your attention. If there are any questions or any things you'd like to know more about, please feel free to contact me or my colleagues at any time.